The resurrection of Jesus acquires such decisive significance because it's not just someone or anyone that's been raised from the dead, but because it is Jesus of Nazareth who was publicly executed and crucified on the basis of the blasphemous personal claims that he had made. The resurrection of Jesus is significant because of the religio-historical context in which it occurred, namely Jesus' own unparalleled life, ministry, teachings, and personal claims to be the unique Son of God, the absolute revelation of God the Father to mankind, to be able to forgive sins, to stand and speak in God's place, to be the herald of the inbreaking kingdom of God. And I think that the resurrection of Jesus, coming at the climax to such a life and death, stands as God's vindication of those claims for which he was executed as a blasphemer. It is, as it were, a divine imprimatur that these claims are not blasphemous, but are justified, that they are correct, and are confirmed by the God of Israel who was allegedly blasphemed by Jesus. The belief in resurrection from the dead is a belief that's attested about 3 times in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel 37, in Isaiah 26, and in Daniel 12, I believe. And during the intertestamental period, this belief in resurrection from the dead flowered and became a widespread belief in Judaism. During Jesus' own day, the doctrine of the resurrection from the dead was held by the party of the Pharisees, although it was rejected by the party of the Sadducees. And Jesus sided with the Pharisees on this score in opposition to the Sadducees. He believed in the resurrection and argued that the Pharisees were correct in this matter. The Jewish belief in resurrection from the dead was always belief in a physical resurrection, that it was the material body that was raised. In fact, sometimes these could be grossly materialistic in nature in terms of actually assembling the original particles of the body to be raised again from the dead. On other occasions, such as, for example, in the pseudepigraphical book of Baruch, the resurrection involves the physical resurrection of the body in the tomb, but then the body is transformed into a glorified body, taking on a sort of heavenly glory, so that not all of the conceptions of resurrection were grossly materialistic. Sometimes they would have this notion of a transformation, that it would occur at the resurrection to make the body fit for eternal habitation. So that on the typical Jewish view of the resurrection, when the body dies, the flesh decomposes, the bones are then preserved for the day of the resurrection. It was primarily the bones that were the object of the resurrection. And so the Jews were very careful to preserve the bones of the dead in ossuaries or jars until the day of the final resurrection. Meanwhile, the soul of the departed person would go to be with God and would in some way be kept by God in a secure way until the final resurrection at the end of history. And then at the end of the world, at the end of the human age, the body, or the bones more precisely, would be raised to new life, clothed with flesh, resurrection body would appear, and the soul would be infused into the resurrection body again, and the person would be then fit for eternal habitations. And it's interesting to notice that the Christian view of the resurrection, particularly as taught by Paul, is almost 100% similar to this Jewish concept of the resurrection, involving the departure of the soul to God, the body going back to the ground, being laid in the earth, and then the body in the grave being raised at the last day upon the return of Christ, and being reunited with the soul, and then being transformed into, or rising transformed from the dead to go into the new heavens and the new earth. The principal difference between Paul's conception and the Jewish conception is Christ. That when a person dies, a Christian dies, Paul felt that he goes to be in a blissful, conscious fellowship with Christ. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And he says it's better to depart from this body and to be with the Lord in this state of blissful communion. And then the souls, the departed souls of the righteous dead who are with Jesus, will accompany Christ at the time of his second coming, when those who are living upon the earth at that time will then be immediately transformed into the resurrected state. But the addition of this Christological element to the doctrine of the resurrection doesn't change the essential notion of the resurrection for Paul as being a physical resurrection of the remains of the dead person in the tomb, and that person's body being reunited with his departed spirit or soul. All scholars agree that the Christian faith, or the Christian movement, the way as it was called at the first, came into existence because the original disciples firmly and sincerely believed that God had raised Jesus from the dead. And they proclaimed this message everywhere that they went. Indeed, Christianity could not have come into existence without this prior belief. It's difficult to exaggerate what a disaster the crucifixion was for these first disciples. It didn't simply mean that their beloved master was dead and gone. It was far more than that. Under Old Testament law, anyone who was executed by hanging was literally under the curse of God. He was a man accursed by God. And the Jews applied this Deuteronomic passage to crucifixion as well. So that what the crucifixion of Jesus revealed, in effect, was that the Pharisees were right, after all. That for these 3 years, these disciples had been following a man under the malediction of God, a man who was a heretic, a Jewish schismatic, an accursed man. So that the crucifixion put a tremendous question mark behind everything that they had believed and trusted their lives to. And therefore the crucifixion for these disciples was literally a catastrophe. And the resurrection of Jesus is what enabled them to believe that Jesus was Messiah after all, that God had vindicated Jesus by raising him from the dead, despite the fact that the Jewish leaders had crucified him for blasphemy. It showed that his claims were true after all. So that without this prior belief in the resurrection of Jesus, the Christian movement could never have sprung into being. It could never have come to exist. So the question then becomes, well, where in the world did the disciples come up with this outlandish belief that God had raised Jesus from the dead? If you deny that Jesus really did rise from the dead, then you've got to explain the origin of the disciples' beliefs in terms of either Christian influences, pagan influences, or Jewish influences on them. Well, now, obviously, it couldn't have been the result of Christian influences for the simple reason that there wasn't any Christianity yet. Since the belief in Jesus' resurrection was foundational for Christianity, it cannot be explained as the later retrojection of the Christian church back into the records, because there wouldn't have been any Christian church had they not believed in the resurrection to begin with. But neither can it be plausibly explained from the side of pagan influences. Back around the turn of the century in the heyday of the so-called history of religion schools, many comparative religious scholars ransacked the literature of paganism and comparative religion to try to show parallels to certain Christian beliefs in other world religions, including beliefs like the resurrection. And some thought to explain the origin of the disciples' beliefs as the result of the influence of these pagan beliefs. The movement, however, soon collapsed, and this principally for two reasons. First of all, the parallels were spurious. The myths of dying and rising gods, such as Adonis and Osiris in pagan mythology, are not attached to historical persons at all. Rather, these gods are merely symbols for the passage of the seasons, as in winter the god dies, and then in spring he comes back to life again as the new crops come up and the spring brings new birth again. These are merely symbols for the passage of the seasons. And it would be simply unthinkable for the original disciples to believe that their compatriot, Jesus of Nazareth, was risen from the dead on the basis of these myths about dying and rising seasonal gods. But in any case, secondly, there was simply no causal link between these supposed parallels and the disciples' belief in the resurrection of Jesus. Indeed, there is actually no trace at all, historically, of these myths of dying and rising gods in first century Palestine, so that the disciples simply had no contact with these sorts of things, and therefore the causal link is simply missing. Thirdly, what about Jewish beliefs in the resurrection? Well, again, I've described a moment ago how radically different from the resurrection of Jesus the Jewish beliefs about resurrection were. In fact, Joachim Jeremias, a famous German New Testament scholar, has said that there is nothing in ancient Judaism which is even comparable to the resurrection of Jesus. Given their Jewish beliefs about life after death and so forth, confronted with the crucifixion of Jesus, at most the disciples could have simply kept their master's tomb as a shrine, preserved his bones until the day of the resurrection at the end of the world, when they would hope to be rejoined with him and all the righteous of Israel in the kingdom of God. But given their Jewish beliefs, they would not have come up with the absurd idea that God had raised him from the dead already. So that none of these factors serve to account for the origin of the disciples' belief that God had raised Jesus from the dead. We have here a belief which nothing in terms of antecedent historical influences can account for. And therefore it seems to me that the best explanation for the origin of this belief and the origin of the Christian movement itself is that the belief was true. Jesus did rise from the dead, and that explains the origin of the Christian faith. In my book, I lay out about 10 lines of evidence for the empty tomb, so I couldn't possibly hope to summarize it all here. Let me just mention a couple of points. One of the most important facts, I think, undergirding the empty tomb is, oddly enough, the burial story of Jesus. If the burial story of Jesus is accurate, then that means that the site of Jesus' tomb was known to both Jew and Christian alike in Jerusalem. But if that is the case, then it seems to me that the inference that the tomb was found empty is very near at hand. For if the burial site of Jesus were known, then it would have been impossible for the disciples to believe in the resurrection of Jesus and proclaim this in Jerusalem when Jesus' corpse still lay in the tomb. If Christianity or the resurrection was preached in Jerusalem itself, as it was, the very city where Jesus was publicly executed, where his grave remained and was publicly known, the disciples could not possibly have believed that he was risen from the dead in the face of a closed tomb. And even if they had, scarcely anybody else would have believed in them if they proclaimed anything so silly. For a first century Jew, the idea that you could have a spiritual resurrection while the corpse still lay in the tomb was simply unknown. That is an invention of 20th century theology, not first century Judaism. And in any case, the Jewish authorities certainly could have made an end to the whole affair by simply pointing to the closed tomb of Jesus and said, look, that grave is occupied, he is not risen from the dead, and that would have been the end of it. And therefore, the accuracy of the burial story, I think, provides powerful grounds for affirming the historicity of the empty tomb account. And unfortunately, for those who wish to deny the empty tomb, the burial of Jesus is widely recognized to be one of the most historically credible facts that we have about the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth. So that those who deny the empty tomb are also forced to deny the burial story, which is a desperate expedient since it is so historically well attested. So that would just be one aspect. Another aspect of the empty tomb narrative itself, as it's found in the Gospel of Mark, is that this portion of the narrative was probably part of Mark's early source material that he used for describing the passion and the death of Jesus, the last week of Jesus' life and his crucifixion. The burial story marked the close of the passion of Jesus as he is laid in the tomb and the stone is rolled across its entrance. And the empty tomb story was probably part of that passion story, because that story would not have been circulated without victory at its end. Without the empty tomb, the passion story is incomplete. Also, the empty tomb story is connected to the burial account by syntactical and linguistic ties. For example, the pronouns used in the empty tomb story have their antecedents in the burial story, so that it's really one smooth account. Now, when you remember that Mark is the earliest of our Gospels, that means that his source material was even older. And this passion narrative that included the empty tomb story could have gone back to within the AD 30s even. Remember, Jesus was crucified about AD 30. So that we're talking about a source that is extremely old and is therefore a valuable source of historical information. Also, the empty tomb story itself, thirdly, is extremely simple and lacks any signs of legendary development. I think the best way to appreciate this would be to compare it to accounts of the empty tomb that are found in apocryphal Gospels, that is, forgeries dating from the 2nd century, such as the so-called Gospel of Peter. In the Gospel of Peter, the narrative describes the resurrection of Jesus itself coming out of the tomb. The narrative proceeds by saying that during the night there is a loud voice that rings out from heaven, and then the stone across the entrance to the tomb rolls back by itself. Then 2 men are seen coming out of heaven and going into the tomb. Then 3 men come out of the tomb, 2 of them holding up the 3rd man. The heads of the 2 men stretch up to the clouds, but the head of the 3rd man overpasses the clouds. Then a cross comes out of the tomb, and a voice from heaven asks, "Hast thou preached to them that sleep?" And the cross answers, "Yea." Now, these are how real legends look. You see, they're colored by all sorts of theological and apologetical motifs. And these are noticeably lacking from the Mark and empty tomb account, which seems to be basically a straightforward report of what actually happened. If I might just mention a couple of other points that I think are significant. The empty tomb was probably discovered by women. And I think that this is evident when you contemplate 2 aspects of the role of women in first century Jewish society. First of all, women occupied, quite frankly, a low rung on the Jewish social ladder. They were second-class citizens in first century Palestine. This is evident from such Jewish rabbinical sayings as the following: "Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women." Or again, "Woe to him whose children are female, but blessings on him whose children are male." Women were not as highly regarded as males in that society. Secondly, the witness of women was regarded as so worthless that they were not even allowed to serve as witnesses in a legal court of law. If a man were seen committing a crime by a group of women, he could not be convicted on the basis of their testimony because their witness was thought to be so unreliable that it wouldn't even be admitted into court. Now, in light of those 2 facts, how remarkable must it be that the empty tomb story describes the discovery of the empty tomb by women. The fact that it is women rather than men who discover Jesus' tomb empty suggests that this is a historically credible account. Any later legend would have certainly made the male disciples to discover the empty tomb, Peter and John, for example. The fact that it is women that discovered the empty tomb, women whose witness was worthless and counted for nothing, is best explained by the fact that, like it or not, they were the ones who found the empty tomb, and the Gospels faithfully record this fact. One final piece of evidence that might be mentioned would be the fact that the earliest Jewish polemic or anti-Christian propaganda itself presupposes the empty tomb. The earliest Jewish polemic that was launched against the Christian proclamation, "He is risen from the dead," was to state that the disciples came by night and stole away his body. And then the Christians responded to that there was a guard at the tomb and they would have prevented the theft and so on and so forth. Now the interesting thing in this dispute is not the historicity of the presence of the guard. Rather, the interesting thing is what the Jewish polemic was saying in response to the Christian proclamation, he is risen from the dead. Were they saying, these men are drunk with new wine, or his tomb is still out there on the hillside? No, they were saying the disciples came and stole away his body. Now think about that for a minute. What that implies is that the body was missing. The earliest Jewish polemic was itself an attempt to explain away the empty tomb. And thus we have evidence for the empty tomb, which comes not from the Christians, but from the very enemies of the earliest Christians themselves, which is historical evidence of first-rate quality, because it comes not from the sources which believed in the resurrection, but from those which disputed it. So on the basis of reasons like this, and many others, the majority of New Testament critics today affirm the historicity of the empty tomb story. The primary evidence that we have for Jesus' post-mortem appearances would come, first of all, from Paul's list of witnesses in 1 Corinthians 15. There he says that when Christ rose from the dead, he appeared to Cephas, or Peter, then to the 12 disciples, then to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom were still alive at the time of his writing, though some had died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and then last of all, says Paul, he appeared also to me. So we have here a list of witnesses that Paul gives who had seen Jesus alive after his death. And certain of these can be correlated with appearances in the Gospels. For example, the appearance to Peter is also mentioned in the Gospel of Luke chapter 24. When the Emmaus disciples come back to Jerusalem, they meet the 12 disciples, or the 11 gathered together, and they say, the Lord is risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. So that we have here two independent testimonies to the fact of an early appearance to Peter, as well as a reference to this perhaps in Mark, where in the angel's words he says, go to Galilee, tell Peter and his disciples he is going before you to Galilee, there you will see him. So that virtually every New Testament scholar that I know of agrees that Peter did experience a resurrection appearance of Jesus shortly after his death. The appearance to the 12 mentioned by Paul next is the best attested appearance of the in the Gospels. This is attested independently in the Gospel of Luke and in the Gospel of John, and concerns Jesus' appearance to the disciples in the upper room. We also have an appearance to the disciples mentioned in Matthew on a mountaintop in Galilee. Whether or not this is to be identified with the appearance to the 12 depends upon whether or not you think the circumstances of its location are legendary or factual, part of the factual narrative. If the location in Jerusalem is factual, such as is attested in both Luke and John, then I think that the mountaintop appearance in Galilee may well be another appearance. In fact, it could be the next appearance mentioned by Paul, the appearance to the 500 brethren. We have no explicit narrative of this in the Gospels, but an appearance to 500 people would have to take place out of doors, given the number involved. Perhaps on a hillside in Galilee, where the thousands had flocked to hear Jesus preach during his lifetime. And it's interesting to notice that the mountaintop appearance in Matthew is different than all the other appearances, in that while all the other ones were unexpected and were by surprise, the mountaintop appearance in Matthew is by appointment. It says that the disciples went to the mountain to which Jesus had appointed them to rendezvous with him, so that it may well be that the 12 were not alone when they met Jesus on the mountaintop. Indeed, the message given to the angel is communicated to the women. Tell Peter and his disciples he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, as he told you. It may well be, I think, that the women accompanied the disciples to Galilee and also witnessed this appearance. And in fact, in Matthew's story, you'll recall he has that cryptic phrase that when Jesus appeared to them on the mountaintop, he said, They worshiped him, but some doubted. Now, could it be that this is a reference to a broader group of people that assembled with the 12 on the mountaintop to meet Jesus at the rendezvous time? I think this is not at all implausible. So it could be that the Matthean appearance is in fact the appearance to the 500 brethren. In any case, I think we have good grounds for accepting the historicity of the appearance to the 500 because of Paul's first-hand contact with them. This was not just a legendary story that Paul had received or heard about, because he knew that some of these people had died in the interim, and he was aware that most of them were still alive, and he is saying, in effect, they're still there to be questioned. You can talk to the witnesses. He could never have made that kind of challenge if this event had not occurred. So I think we have good grounds for affirming the appearance to the 500 on the basis of what Paul says. Next, he says that Jesus appeared to James, the brother of Jesus. And it's interesting that James and Peter, the two mentioned in the list in 1 Corinthians 15, are the two people that that Paul met with when he first went up to Jerusalem after his conversion, after being in Damascus for 3 years. He spent 2 weeks in Jerusalem on a fact-finding trip, during which time he said he met with Peter and James. And those are the two men that he refers to in the list. Now, we don't have any independent narrative of the appearance of Jesus to his younger brother James, but I think we have very good grounds for affirming its historicity. Why? Well, simply because neither James nor indeed any of the brothers of Jesus were apparently believers in Jesus during his lifetime. We have good evidence in the Gospels that show that none of Jesus' brothers thought that Jesus was the Messiah or the Lord or anybody particularly special. In fact, we have one fairly vicious story where the brothers of Jesus try to goad him into a death trap by showing himself publicly at a feast when they knew that the Jewish leaders were trying to persecute and kill him. And yet, we know also that later on in the early church, James, the brother of Jesus, emerges as one of the pillars of the New Testament church and finally one of the leaders of the church. R.H. Fuller, who is a fairly liberal New Testament critic, has said that even if there were not an appearance to James mentioned by Paul, we should have to invent one to explain the transformation that occurred in James between the time of his unbelieving days when Jesus was alive on earth and his leadership in the early church. I mean, most of us have brothers. What would it take to make you believe that your brother is the Lord, such that you would be willing to go to your death for this belief, as James did when he was martyred in AD 67 by the Jewish Sanhedrin for his belief that Jesus was in fact Lord, Son of God, and Messiah? Can there be any doubt that the reason for this change in James is what Paul says, then he appeared to James? Then Paul mentions the appearance to all the apostles. We don't know exactly what group this was, probably a group somewhat wider than the 12. Luke says that Jesus appeared during a period of 40 days to the disciples, and this was probably some appearance during that time. And then finally Paul says he appeared also to me. And this is again a conversion as remarkable as James. Saul was a Jewish Pharisee. He was a persecutor of the church. He hated the Christian heresy and was determined to do everything in his power to stamp it out. He was actually responsible for the deaths of Christian men and women simply because of their faith in Jesus Christ. And then it all turned around for this man, because on the road to Damascus, he saw this appearance of Jesus. And he said, I saw Jesus our Lord. And this is what caused Saul the Pharisee to be transformed into Paul, the apostle and missionary of early Christianity. And this is undeniably attested in his own letters in the first hand. So that we have in Paul's information very good grounds for believing that various individuals and groups of people under various circumstances saw appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. And the gospel accounts, I think, provide confirmation and attestation that goes to confirm and fill out the details of these appearance stories. This has been suggested by a number of critics, but I think there are some insuperable problems with the hallucination hypothesis. Number one, the wide variety of the locations, the circumstances, and the witnesses to these appearances belie the hallucination hypothesis. Jesus was not just seen on one occasion, but on many occasions. Not just by one individual, but by many persons. Not just by single persons, but by actual groups of people. Not at one locale and circumstance, but at many different places and under many different circumstances. And this wide variety of circumstances, people, locale, and so forth, I think simply makes the hallucination hypothesis quite improbable. A second problem with the hallucination hypothesis is that I think we have good grounds for affirming the historical credibility of the gospel accounts of these appearances. And these appearances were clearly physical and bodily appearances. I do not think that you can dismiss this element of the narrative as being merely legendary, because it is unanimous throughout the narratives, it's consistent, and also the date of the Gospels is too close to the time of the events recorded to have allowed such a total corruption of non-physical appearances into this consistent and unanimous tradition of physical appearances. So the very physicality of the resurrection appearances, I think, undercuts the hallucination hypothesis. A third problem with the hallucination theory is that I do not think it accounts for why the disciples came to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus. You see, the Jewish concept of resurrection differed from the resurrection of Jesus in that the Jewish conception was always a resurrection after the end of the world, at the end of history, and it was always a general resurrection of all the people, never of an isolated individual. But in Jesus' case, you had the resurrection of an isolated individual within history, something which was simply unknown in Judaism. The Jewish frame of thought had another category which would have nicely explained hallucinations if the disciples had had them, namely the notion of assumption into heaven or translation into heaven. Certain Old Testament figures such as Enoch and Elijah did not physically die, but were assumed directly into heaven. And this category could be applied to recently deceased persons as well as living ones. So that had the disciples seen hallucinations of Jesus, they would have seen hallucinations of Jesus glorified in Abram's bosom or in paradise. This is where the souls of the righteous dead went to be with God when they died. And seeing hallucinations of Jesus glorified like this would at most have led the disciples to proclaim the assumption or the translation of Jesus into heaven, not his resurrection from the dead, which went decisively contrary to Jewish thinking in at least two fundamental respects. And finally, number four, the hallucination hypothesis says nothing to explain the fact of the empty tomb. You have to conjoin some additional independent hypothesis to the hallucination theory in order to explain the empty tomb. But the single hypothesis of Jesus' resurrection from the dead explains both the appearances and the empty tomb, and therefore has greater explanatory scope and simplicity, and is therefore the preferred explanation. And therefore, for reasons such as these, I think that the hallucination hypothesis is not the best explanation of the evidence. I think that the writings of the evangelists are confirmed by what we have in what is sometimes called the fifth gospel, namely the writings of the Apostle Paul. Paul was a Pharisee, Saul of Tarsus, who was involved in the persecution of the early church, and in an incredible turnaround, he became a Christian because he claimed to have seen an appearance of the risen Jesus. And this turned this man's life upside down. From a Pharisee and persecutor of the early church, he became an ardent Christian missionary who entered into a life of incredible hardship, suffering, and labor, and ultimately made the final sacrifice when he was martyred for his faith in Rome. And Paul hands down to us certain crucial pieces of information, very early traditions about the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, some of the earliest material concerning the resurrection is delivered by Paul in the first letter that he wrote to the church in Corinth, in the 15th chapter of his letter to the Corinthians. He cites there a tradition which he says he himself received and then handed on to the Corinthian church. And the words here are the technical rabbinical terms for the transmission of Jewish tradition. And the saying that follows this introduction is then a very stylized and non-Pauline tradition in which Paul says Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. He was buried. He was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. And he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. And then after that, Paul goes on to continue piling up other eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus, including an appearance to some 500 people, most of whom Paul says are still alive at the time of his writing, around AD 55, though he says some have died. Paul is saying, in effect, the witnesses are still alive. They're still there to be questioned, even though Paul knew that some had passed away in the meantime. So this information that Paul gives us about the resurrection appearances, I think, is very important because it refers to some of the same appearances that we have mentioned in the Gospels, particularly the appearance to the 12 disciples, which is also related in Luke and John, and provides an early, incontrovertible attestation to the historicity of those appearances so that these cannot be written off as later legends that the evangelists eventually committed to writing. I also think that Paul's information furnishes good grounds for belief in the empty tomb as well. Paul's letters are what might be called accidental letters, in the sense that he's not writing systematic theological treatises, nor is he writing a history or a life of Jesus. They're not Gospels. The letters are accidental in the sense that they respond to various particular situations and questions and problems in the churches that he pastored. And so he doesn't have occasion to specifically mention the empty tomb as such, but I think that Paul implies the empty tomb in a couple of the things that he says. In this tradition that he cites in 1 Corinthians 15, the phrase, "he was buried," followed by the phrase, "and he was raised," implies an empty grave. No first century Jew, and particularly Pharisee, could have thought otherwise. The idea that a man was buried and then raised by God from the dead, but that his corpse still lay in the tomb, would have been an impossible contradiction for a first century Jew. For a first century Jew, there was simply no difference in meaning between a resurrection and a physical grave emptying resurrection. So that in citing these chronological events, he was executed, he was crucified, he was buried, he was raised, he appeared, Paul in effect implies an empty tomb. This is confirmed, I think, when you compare the 4 lines of this tradition to the preaching in the book of Acts, the early apostolic sermons, and when you compare it to the narratives in the Gospels. What you find is that this 4-line tradition handed on by Paul is in effect an outline of the early apostolic preaching. And when you compare it to the preaching in the book of Acts, these early apostolic sermons, the first line corresponds to the event of the crucifixion. The second line, "he was buried," corresponds to Jesus' being laid in the tomb. The third line, "and he was raised," corresponds to the empty tomb narrative. So that I think that this is a summary of the story of the empty tomb. And Paul knew the traditions surrounding the material that he delivered. We know this, for example, from the information he gives about the Lord's Supper, where he speaks of how he passed on to the Corinthians what he received about the Lord on the night that he was betrayed, took bread, etc. And in that story, Paul mentions that this was the night Jesus was betrayed. Well, now, the betrayal story is not part of the Last Supper story. That is part of its context. In mentioning the betrayal, Paul shows us that he knows not just the isolated event, but he knows the context of the traditions that he delivered. And therefore, in relating this tradition about the burial, the resurrection of Jesus, I think it's quite certain that Paul knew the context of this and knew the empty tomb story. Now, a second indication that Paul gives, I think, of the empty tomb is the dating of the empty tomb on the third day, or rather of the resurrection on the third day, when he says that Christ was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. Where do we get this phrase, on the third day? Well, I think the most likely explanation is that this is a time indicator for the discovery of the empty tomb by the women who came on early Sunday morning, which after Jewish reckoning was on the third day after the crucifixion, so that the resurrection naturally came to be dated on the third day, because this was the day that the empty tomb was discovered by the women followers of Jesus. So I think that implicit in the information delivered by Paul is the fact of the empty tomb, as well as his explicit mention of the resurrection appearances. And Paul's information, I think, would be the most important material in the New Testament outside the Gospels that goes to confirm what the Gospels say. I think, in fact, that the idea of a spiritual resurrection is an oxymoron. It's really a contradiction in terms. I would challenge any critical scholar to explain to me clearly and carefully what the difference is between the resurrection of an immaterial, unextended, intangible, invisible body and the immortality of Jesus' soul. Everyone agrees that the New Testament, and particularly Paul, did not teach the mere immortality of Jesus' soul. But I cannot understand for the life of me what the difference is between this supposed spiritual resurrection body and the simple idea of the immortality of the soul. And the immortality of the soul is a Greek notion. It's not a New Testament notion in terms of the final state of immortality. And therefore, I think that the fact that so many people find themselves averse to this physicality of the resurrection is a sort of vestige of Greek philosophy. It's a hangover of the depreciation of the material body, the physical body, and a sort of longing for a spiritual, heavenly existence, the soul escaping from the prison house of the body, that is simply, I think, unbiblical. So I would say, in the first place, that the idea of a spiritual resurrection really cannot be sustained because it's not distinct from the immortality of Jesus' soul. In addition to that, however, I would argue that the New Testament quite clearly teaches the resurrection of the body. Paul is very clear that it is the body that is buried, the body that is sown, that is the same body that will be raised. It is numerically identical. There is not the replacement of the earthly body with a new body, a substitute body. There is numerical identity, but a transformation that occurs between the earthly body and the resurrection body. A transformation that involves a transition from mortality to immortality, dishonor to glory, from corruptibility to incorruptibility, and so forth. But there's no suggestion that the earthly body is rescued from materiality. For Paul to talk about an unextended, invisible, intangible, immaterial body would simply be a contradiction in terms. So the very notion that Paul is talking about a resurrection body, I think, indicates the physicality of the resurrection state. I think that one's philosophical presuppositions will be an important guide in doing historical work with respect to the New Testament narratives, because these narratives overtly present a supernatural Jesus, a Jesus who performs miracles, a Jesus who rises from the dead. And if you come to these narratives with a presupposition of scientific naturalism or even methodological naturalism, that is to say that as a historian you will not allow supernatural causes to enter the picture, then these events will be ruled out of court in advance, regardless of the evidence. And I think this is fundamentally the problem with the methodology employed by the infamous Jesus seminar of the Westar Institute in California. In the introduction to their edition of the Five Gospels, they make it very clear that for them the first pillar of scholarly wisdom, as they put it, is scientific naturalism. They point out that Strauss in the last century distinguished between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history precisely on the criterion of supernaturalism, and that anything that had supernatural aspects to it was by definition relegated to myth rather than history. Now, this is not a matter of argument. It's not a matter of evidence. This is simply a matter of definition. The supernatural is defined as being in the category of mythical, not historical. And if you begin with those sorts of presuppositions, then of course the resurrection will be evaluated as unhistorical because you've defined it to be unhistorical. So when the seminar comes, for example, to the words spoken by the risen Jesus, they state by definition the words ascribed to the risen Christ cannot be historically verified. But they add, sometimes words spoken during Jesus' lifetime are placed on the lips of the risen Jesus, and so they say, we will evaluate these sayings as though they were uttered by a historical person. Well, it couldn't be clearer that they think of the risen Christ as not a historical individual, and that this is done so not on the basis of evidence, but on the basis of presuppositions. So these presuppositions are going to be critical. R.T. France, who is a British New Testament scholar, has remarked that on the level of their literary and historical quality, the Gospels deserve to be taken seriously as sources for a life of Jesus. He says that compared to the sources for ancient history in Greco-Roman times, the Gospels compare very favorably. But he points out that the degree to which one will be ready to trust these documents depends more upon one's openness to a supernatural worldview than it does upon their literary and historical qualities. So I think this is absolutely crucial. And all that I suppose needs to be added here is that philosophically, I see no reason to adopt such a philosophical naturalism. It seems to me that only an atheist could be justified in saying that miracles are impossible, because unless you have some proof of atheism, you have to be open to the possibility that God exists, and if that is even possible, then it's possible that he's acted in history. So in the absence of any proof for atheism, which I don't think anyone has, we have to be open to the possibility of the supernatural and let the evidence speak for itself. I think that the personal significance of the resurrection of Jesus lies in the fact that it means that Jesus holds the key that unlocks the door to eternal life. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And I believe that Jesus' resurrection shows that he holds the solution to this most difficult of all human predicaments, namely death itself. It shows us that through Jesus Christ, we also can hope for life beyond the grave, and hope for a life, therefore, of meaningful and eternal significance through him. So that I think that the resurrection of Jesus has its personal significance in solving this existential problem of death and the meaning of life.